The lawyer set her father's will upon the long table and told her, in front of the whole mourning house, that she had been left nothing but the lantern by the gate. Beatrice Hartwell did not weep, because she had read her father's hand 1,000 times, and the slope of the letters on that page was not his. She stood in the cold drawing room of Thornfield with her gloved hands folded, and she let them believe she was beaten, because a woman who shows her cards at a funeral has already lost the game. The candles guttered along the mantel. The black crepe over the mirror moved a little when the door opened, as if the house itself were breathing. Augusta Vane, who had been her father's wife for 3 short years and was now mistress of everything, dabbed at a dry eye with a handkerchief that had never been wet. The solicitor, Mr. Silas Crane, folded his spectacles and said the word again, gently, the way men say cruel things when they wish to seem kind. Nothing. To the daughter of the house, nothing but the old brass carriage lantern that hung beside the gate, the one her father had lit himself every evening of her childhood, so that no traveler would lose the road to their door. Beatrice looked at the page, and then at Crane, and then at the woman in the chair, and she said only that she would like to take the lantern with her when she went. Augusta smiled into her handkerchief. It was a smile Beatrice would remember for a long time, and one she would, in the end, repay in a coin neither of them could yet imagine. She had been 21 for 11 days. Her father had been dead for 9, and the will that disinherited her had been signed, the date plainly written, on an evening when Beatrice had sat at her father's bedside and held his hand and watched him too weak to lift a spoon, let alone a pen. She did not say this in the drawing room. She breathed once, slowly, and she filed it away, the way she filed away everything she could not yet use. There is a particular discipline a person learns when they cannot afford to be wrong, and Beatrice had learned it at her father's knee, without either of them ever calling it that. You do not show the room what you have seen. You do not let the slope of a letter or the date upon a page move your face. You hold it. The way you hold a coal you mean to carry across a dark yard, close and careful and out of the wind, until you reach the place where it can be set down to do its work. So she held what she had seen. She let Augusta dab at her dry eye, and let Crane fold his spectacles, and let the great cold room of Thornfield decide that the daughter of the house had taken her ruin meekly, and she walked out of that room with her back straight and her hands folded, and the single coal of the truth carried close against her, and not one of them guessed that anything at all was burning. The night had begun, simply enough, 3 years before, when her father came home from London, with a new wife and a tired look, and told his daughter that he had done a foolish thing for a kind reason. Hartwell had been a gentleman, and a poor manager of money. He had loved horses he could not afford, and friends who borrowed and forgot, and somewhere in the long, careless slide of his middle years, he had mortgaged Thornfield twice over, and signed papers he did not read. Augusta Vane had arrived with a fortune of her own, and a brother in trade, and a way of looking at a room as though she were pricing the contents. She had paid the second mortgage. She had, in the language of the parish, saved the family. And in return, she had asked only to be loved, which her husband could not quite manage, and to be obeyed, which his daughter would not. Beatrice remembered the first dinner, the new stepmother at the foot of the table where her own mother had sat, the candlelight kind to no one. She remembered being told that a young lady of reduced fortune ought to make herself useful, and that there was no shame in honest work, and that the schoolroom at the top of the house would do very well for her, now that the good rooms were wanted for guests. She had not argued. She had a habit, learned early and kept hard, of wanting less than she was offered, so that she could never be surprised by having it taken away. If you have ever loved someone who learned, the hard way, to keep their light small so that the world could not put it out, then you already understand Beatrice better than the people in this house ever did, and you are exactly the sort of listener these candlelit stories are told for, so light a candle of your own and stay close. because this is a story about how a woman that small and that overlooked is finally, against everything, seen. She read in the cold schoolroom, and she walked in the wet gardens, and she lit the lantern by the gate herself when the groom forgot, because her father was too ill by then to do it, and because some nights she liked to stand at the gate in the dark and watch the small flame hold against the wind and tell herself that a thing did not have to be large to refuse to go out. She had been a child who was loved once, and she remembered it the way one remembers a warm room from the cold of a corridor. She remembered her mother's voice and her father's laugh from the years before the money troubles, before the second wife, before the schoolroom. She remembered her father lifting her up to light the lantern when her arms were too short to reach the wick, his hand steady over hers on the long match, telling her that the light was a promise, a house made to the dark, that as long as a lamp burned at the gate, anyone lost on the road that night would know there was a door somewhere that would open to them. She had not understood it then as anything but a pretty thing her father said. She understood it now. A young lady of reduced fortune learns the value of an open door because she learns, slowly and thoroughly, how many of them close. Augusta Vane closed them with a smile and a soft word and an air of doing only what was sensible. The good rooms were wanted. The young lady would be more comfortable upstairs. There was no shame in honest work, and a girl who would not see it was a girl who thought too well of herself. Beatrice did not think too well of herself. She thought, in fact, very little of herself at all by then, which was the slow, quiet poison of those 3 years, and she would not understand, until much later, in a gold room in another house, how much of herself she had been persuaded to set down and leave in the dark. Her father died on a gray morning with his hand in hers. He had tried to speak, near the end, and what he managed was her name, and then a single word that she could not understand, a sound like a place or a key, and then nothing. She had bent close. She had asked him to say it again. He had only pressed her fingers, twice, the way he used to when she was small and frightened. 2 slow presses that meant, "Be still, I am here." And then his hand had gone heavy, and he was not there at all. 9 days later, a stranger's hand on a will told her she owned a lantern. She left Thornfield on foot the next morning with 2 dresses, 3 books, and the lantern wrapped in her shawl, and she did not look back at the windows, because she knew who was watching from them, and she would not give that woman the gift of her face. She walked the 11 miles to the town of Ashby, where her father's sister had once lived, and found the house sold and the aunt 3 years dead. And she sat on a milestone at the edge of the road with the lantern in her lap and let herself, for exactly the length of one held breath, consider how completely alone she was. Then she breathed out. She had heard, in the kitchen at Thornfield, where servants speak the truth that drawing rooms will not, that the great house at Ravensworth wanted a governess for no one, which was a strange thing to want, and paid well for the wanting. She did not know what it meant. She knew only that it was a roof and a wage, and a door, that Augusta Vane had not closed. She borrowed a ride on a carter's wagon, and arrived at the gates of Ravensworth Hall as the light was going gold across the long park, and she stood holding her father's lantern and looked up at a house so large it seemed less a building than a kind of weather. A man was standing at the foot of the steps in his shirt sleeves, doing something to the wheel of a curricle, and he straightened when he heard the gravel and looked at her without warmth and without much interest. A tall man, perhaps 32, dark-haired, with the kind of face that has decided not to be liked, because being liked has cost it before. He asked her what she wanted at the servants' hour, and she told him she had come about the governess's post, and he looked at the lantern in her hands, and at the dust on her hem, and at her straight back, which she could not help, and something flickered behind his eyes that she could not read, and did not yet care to. He told her the housekeeper would see her at the kitchen door. He told her this not unkindly, but as a man states a fact, and he turned back to the wheel. She thanked him, and went around the house as she had been told, and it was only 3 days later, when she was made to stand at the foot of the great staircase, while the master of the house came down to look at the new servant, that she understood the man with the curricle had been the Earl of Ravensworth himself, and that he had let her walk to the kitchen door without a word, and that he did not appear to remember her face at all. She told herself it did not matter, and it did not, and yet she found herself turning the small slight over that first night in the narrow bed under the eaves, not with hurt exactly, but with a kind of weary recognition. The recognition of a woman who has learned that the world looks at the dust on a hem before it looks at the face above it. She had been somebody's daughter once, with a name that opened the doors of the county. Now she was a hem and a wage and a back too straight for a servant, and a man could look directly at her and see nothing worth remembering. She did not weep over it. She had stopped weeping over things that could not be helped a long time before. But she lay in the dark with her father's lantern unlit on the floor beside her, because she had not yet dared to light it in a strange house, and she thought that perhaps it was better this way, to be unseen, that a woman who is not looked at is a woman who is not watched, and that there are kinds of safety in being overlooked that the comfortable never need to learn. She would have occasion, before that autumn ended, to revise that thought entirely. But on that first night she held to it, and she slept, and in the morning she rose before the rest of the house and went down to begin her work, and the great cold weight of Ravensworth Hall settled around her like the weather she had thought it. Edmund Ravensworth had not wanted a governess, and had not advertised for one. He had wanted, when his solicitor pressed him about the empty estate and the need to seem settled, to be left alone, and the post had been his steward's invention, a fiction to fill a wing of the house with the appearance of life. He had buried a wife 2 years before, a marriage arranged for land and held together by nothing, a cold, quiet woman who had died of a fever in a house she had hated, and he had discovered at her funeral that he could not feel the grief he was expected to feel, and had despised himself for the lack. Since then, he had let the great rooms shut one by one. He had let the gardens go a little wild. He had learned to prefer the company of horses, which did not require him to pretend, and he had built around himself a coldness so complete that the county had stopped expecting him at its dinners, and begun, in the way of counties, to invent reasons for it. He had married, the first time, the way men of his station married, which is to say, without consulting his heart, because his father had arranged it and the lands adjoined, and the lady was suitable, and he had gone into it believing that affection would come, as he had been assured it generally did. It had not come. His wife had been a quiet, dutiful, profoundly unhappy woman, who had wanted, he understood far too late, exactly what he had wanted, and been just as unable to ask for it. And the two of them had lived in the great house, like two travelers obliged to share a carriage on a long, cold road, polite, separate, each privately certain that the fault and the failure were their own. She had sickened in the third winter. She had died in the fourth. And he had stood at her grave and felt nothing but a vast and shameful relief, swiftly followed by a self-loathing so complete that it had hollowed him out. Because a man who cannot grieve his own dead wife, he had decided, is a man with something broken at his center. A man who had better keep to his horses and his accounts and trouble no one else with the cold thing he is. That was the man who came down the great staircase that morning to inspect a new servant he had not asked for. When he came down the staircase that morning and saw the new governess standing very straight at the bottom with her hands folded and her chin level, he felt, for the first time in a long while, watched by someone who was not afraid of him, and he disliked the feeling because it asked something of him. He asked her name. She told him. He nodded and said he hoped she would find the house comfortable, and he had already half turned away when his steward murmured that Miss Hartwell would have charge of the late Earl's library and correspondence, there being no children in the house, and Edmund stopped and looked at her again, properly this time, and saw that she had heard the absurdity of the arrangement and had decided to say nothing of it, and he respected her for that, against his will. He asked, because cruelty had become a habit he wore like a coat, whether she could read. She said she could. He asked whether she could read Latin. She said she could, and Greek if it was needed, and her father's hand, which was worse than either. There was a silence in the great hall. A footman looked at his shoes. Edmund Ravensworth looked at the governess for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone, and then he said that the library was in a disgraceful state, and she might begin whenever she liked, and he went out to his horses, and he did not understand, walking away, why his heart was beating as though he had run. She began the next morning. The library at Ravensworth was a long gold room with tall windows that faced the morning, and the light came in across 10,000 books that no one had opened in years, and dust hung in the bright air, like something suspended in honey. Beatrice stood in the doorway, with her father's lantern in her hand, which she carried everywhere now, partly because it was the only thing in the world that was hers, and partly because lighting it each evening had become a small, private rite, a way of saying to her dead father that she had survived another day. She set the lantern on a side table, where the morning sun caught the brass and made it shine, and she rolled up her sleeves, and she began to bring order to chaos, because order was the one form of power that no one had ever thought to take from her. The work was endless, and she was glad of it. She catalogued, and she dusted, and she carried armfuls of damp-smelling volumes to the windows to dry, and she found, in the long mornings of that first month, a strange contentment she had not expected, the contentment of a useful task in a quiet room. She made the room hers, in the small ways a person makes a borrowed thing their own. She found a ladder, and a cloth, and a method, and she worked through the shelves systematically, west wall to east, top to bottom, and as the weeks passed, a kind of order began to emerge from the long neglect, the books standing upright in their families again, the air losing its smell of damp and mice, and gaining instead the dry, clean smell of paper and beeswax. She kept her father's lantern on the side table by the window where the morning caught it, and she lit it each evening when the light failed, and worked on by its small, steady glow, even when there were candles enough to be had, because the lighting of it was a thing she did for him, a small daily keeping of faith, and because the gold of it on the spines of the books was the warmest thing in that cold house, and she had earned, she felt, the right to a little warmth. She talked to no one for days at a stretch, and did not mind it. She had been lonely for so long that solitude had stopped feeling like loneliness, and started feeling like rest. The earl did not trouble her. She saw him sometimes from the windows, riding out across the park at dawn, a dark figure on a gray horse, and she saw him at a distance in the corridors, and twice he came into the library for a book, and did not find her, because she had learned the sound of his step, and made herself scarce, not out of fear, but out of a sense that the man wished above all to be unseen, and that she would grant him that, having so often wished it for herself. But the house talks, as houses do. From Mrs. Dunmore the housekeeper, a square kind woman who had served 3 generations, Beatrice learned the shape of the earl's grief. She learned of the cold marriage and the colder wife, of the funeral where he had not wept, of the long shutting of the rooms. She learned that he was a good master who paid fairly and asked little, and that the servants were loyal to him in the fierce private way that servants reserve for the masters the world has misjudged. And she learned, one wet afternoon over tea in the housekeeper's room, that the earl was in trouble of a kind that no amount of land could mend, that his late father had left debts the estate could not carry, that there were men in London who held his paper, and that the only road out anyone could see was the oldest and ugliest road there was, a marriage to money. Beatrice said nothing to this. She stirred her tea, but she carried the knowledge back up to the library with her, and she set it beside her own knowledge, the knowledge of a will written in a hand, that was not her father's, and signed on a night her father could not hold a pen. And for the first time since she had walked out of Thornfield, she felt something other than grief move in her, something with an edge to it, something that might, if she let it, become a plan. She saw the Earl properly, for the first time, 3 weeks into October, on the night the river rose. It had rained for 4 days without stopping, a hard gray rain that turned the park to mud and filled the ditches, and at last sent the river over its low meadows in the dark. And the alarm came up to the house near midnight, a groom hammering at the kitchen door with the news that the water was into the tenant cottages along the bottom land. And there were families with the flood at their thresholds, and the night as black as a closed coffin. The house woke in confusion. Servants ran in the corridors. And Beatrice, who had come down for a candle and found the kitchen in an uproar, did the thing she'd been raised to do before she had time to remember that it was no longer her place to do it. She took charge of the part no one was attending to. While the men went out into the dark with lanterns and ropes, she set the kitchen to heating water and tearing sheets into bandages and getting down every blanket in the house, and she sent a maid to make up beds in the shut rooms because there would be cold, wet, frightened people coming, and she did it all quietly, without fuss, in the level voice of a woman who has run a household and knows where everything is kept, and the servants, glad of someone to tell them what to do, did it. The Earl came back near dawn, soaked to the skin and gray with cold and exhaustion, having stood in the flood himself to the waist passing children up to safety, and he came into his own kitchen expecting chaos, and found instead order, a great fire and hot food and dry beds, and a calm, pale woman in a plain dress moving among his frightened tenants with a steadiness that had clearly held the house together for hours. He stopped in the doorway. He watched her wrap a shivering old woman in a blanket and press a cup of something hot into her hands and say a low word that made the old woman almost smile. And he saw her glance up and catch his eye and incline her head, not as a servant defers to a master, but as one tired, competent person acknowledges another across a hard night's work. And Edmund Ravensworth felt something shift in his chest that he had thought permanently frozen, and he did not have a name for it yet, and he did not want one. He crossed the kitchen and asked her, low, how it stood. She told him plainly, in numbers, who was safe, and who was still out, and what was wanted, and what was in hand. And he listened, and when she had finished, he said only that she had done well. 2 words, the way a man says a thing he means, and does not know how to enlarge, and she said that anyone would have, which was not true, and they both knew it. And for a moment in the steam and the lamplight of the crowded kitchen, they simply looked at each other, and then a child cried, and the moment broke, and there was work to do. But it had happened. Whatever it was, it had happened, and neither of them, afterward, could quite undo it. In the days after the flood, the house treated her differently, and she felt it. The small shift in how the servants spoke to her, the new respect in Mrs. Dunmore's manner, and she knew that word of how she had held the kitchen together had reached the master, and that the master had not forgotten it. He sent for her, 2 days after, to the small study where he kept his accounts. She went expecting some new instruction about the library, and found instead that he wished, awkwardly, in his flat way, to thank her properly, and to ask whether there was anything the house could do to make her more comfortable. And she understood that this was a man wholly unpracticed, at kindness offering it for the first time in a long while, and finding it harder than cruelty. She might have asked for many things: a better room, a higher wage. She asked for none of them. She asked only that she be permitted to keep her father's lantern lit in the library of an evening, that no one move it or trouble it, because it was the one thing in the world that was hers, and the lighting of it was a private matter between herself and a dead man, and she would not have it interfered with. It was a strange request, and they both knew it, and the Earl looked at her for a moment, as though she had shown him, without meaning to, a great deal more than she had said, and then he gave his word, gravely, that the lantern would be hers, and undisturbed for as long as she lived under his roof. And there was something in the way he said it, some weight beyond the smallness of the thing, that made her look away first. It was the first boundary she had drawn in that house. It was, she would think later, the first time in 3 years she had asked for anything at all and been given it without a price, and it taught her, in the smallest possible way, that not every door in the world was waiting to close, and that lesson, more than the flood or the library or any single evening, was the true beginning of the thing that grew between them. The man who held the Earl's paper came to Ravensworth in the second week of October, and Beatrice knew his face before she knew his name, because she had last seen it folding a pair of spectacles in the drawing-room at Thornfield, and saying the word nothing. Mr. Silas Crane had risen in the world. He came in a good carriage now, with a clerk in a leather case, and he was shown into the great hall, and Beatrice, carrying a stack of ledgers across the gallery above, stopped where the shadow was deep and looked down at the top of his gray head, and felt the whole cold morning go very still. She did not know yet how the threads connected. She knew only that the man who had read a forged will over her father's body now did business in this house, and that such a coincidence was not a coincidence at all, and that she had been right to come here, though she had not known why. She drew back into the shadow, and she listened, and she learned 3 things before the gallery clock struck the half-hour. She learned that Crane had bought up the Earl's debts himself, quietly, over 2 years, so that the man who held Edmund Ravensworth by the throat was not a syndicate of strangers in London, but one patient lawyer in a good coat. She learned that Crane had a proposal that would settle everything, an arrangement, he called it, advantageous to all parties. And she learned, when a second carriage came up the drive, and a woman's voice rang out bright and confident in the hall, that the arrangement had a face, and the face belonged to Miss Cordelia Finch, the orphaned heiress of a Manchester cotton fortune, Crane's own ward, a handsome, smiling girl of 19 with £30,000 and a laugh like breaking glass, and that the price of the Earl's freedom was to be his hand. Beatrice stood very still in the gallery and listened to a marriage being arranged the way other men arrange the sale of a horse, and she found, to her own surprise, that the thing rising in her was not satisfaction at the symmetry of it, but something hot and protective and entirely unwelcome, a feeling she had no right to and could not name, on behalf of a cold, proud man who did not know her face. If you've made it this far into Beatrice's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The Earl refused. He refused at first the way a proud man refuses anything, coldly and finally, and without explanation. And Beatrice, who heard the whole of it from the gallery, felt her heart lift in a way she did not examine. But Silas Crane was not a man who took a first refusal for an answer, because he had not become rich by taking first answers. And he laid his papers on the table in the great hall, and he spoke quietly of dates, of notes falling due, of the particular mercy of the law toward creditors, and its particular coldness toward debtors of good family who could not pay, and he let the silence do the rest. He did not threaten. He never threatened. He merely arranged the facts upon the table, the way he had once arranged a will, so that the only sensible course appeared to be the one he wished. And then he folded his hands and waited, and the great house ticked around them, and the Earl stood at the window with his back to the lawyer and looked out at the park his father had loved and his grandfather had planted, and Beatrice above watched the line of his shoulders and understood that he was going to say yes, and that it was going to cost him something she could see even from a gallery. He turned. He asked for terms. Crane, smiling, gave them. The wedding would be small and soon. The lady would bring her fortune. The Earl would bring his name, his title, and the access to society that a cotton fortune could not buy on its own, and everyone would have what they wanted, and no one would have to speak the word that hung in the air, which was that a man was being purchased, and that the purchaser was a smiling girl who did not yet know She was a purchaser too. Cordelia Finch came up to be looked at the next day. She was, Beatrice saw, not unkind, only young and bright and entirely unaware. A girl who had been told her whole life that her money made her wonderful and had no reason yet to doubt it. And she swept through the great rooms exclaiming at the pictures and the plate and the gloom, and she pronounced the library frightful and dusty, and asked who the pale woman by the window was, and was told the governess, and lost interest at once, the way the secure lose interest in the unimportant. Beatrice curtsied and said nothing, and went on with her work, and she told herself that the small, cold thing in her chest was not jealousy, because she had no claim and wanted none, and she almost believed it. There was a dinner that week. A small county dinner got up to introduce the bride to the neighborhood, and the library, by some oversight or some design, was wanted for the gentleman's withdrawal after. And so Beatrice was obliged to be in the house during the evening, moving quietly at its edges, and she saw more than she wished to see. She saw Cordelia Finch at the foot of the long table, bright and laughing, sure of her welcome. She saw the earl at the head of it, courteous and remote, performing the part of the contented bridegroom with a coldness that no one at the table seemed to notice but her, because she alone in that house had seen what his face looked like when it was warm. And she saw, when she carried a stack of books through the hall and Cordelia's eye fell on her, the careless, instinctive way the secure dismissed the unimportant, the bright girl's glance sliding over the plain woman in the doorway and away again as though over a piece of furniture, and a remark made low to her neighbor, and a small laugh. And Beatrice stood in the cold hall with the books in her arms and felt the old familiar smallness rise up to swallow her. The schoolroom at the top of the house, the seat below the family, the long lesson of being made to know her place. And then she felt something else, something new, something the autumn in the gold room had quietly grown in her without her noticing. She felt that she did not believe it anymore. She looked at the bright, sure girl at the table and the cold performing man at the head of it, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that the girl had everything the world counted and yet did not have, and would never have, the one thing Beatrice had been given for free in a library by lamplight, which was to be truly seen by that man, and known, and answered. And she carried her books back up to the quiet library, and set them down, and stood a while with her hand on the warm brass of the lantern. And the small, cold thing in her chest, she found, had changed its nature entirely. It was not jealousy. It was grief, the grief of a woman who has seen, plainly and too late, exactly what she is about to lose, and exactly how much it was worth. The engagement was announced. The county, starved for news of the cold earl, fell upon it gratefully, and Ravensworth Hall, which had been silent for 2 years, began to fill with the noise of preparation. Beatrice kept to the library. She lit her lantern each evening, and she worked late among the books, and it was on one of those late evenings, when the house had gone quiet and she thought herself alone, that the earl found her at last. He came in without knowing she was there, looking for a particular volume, a book of his father's, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw the light, the small, warm pool of the lantern on the table, and the woman bent over a ledger beside it, and he stood for a moment unobserved, and looked at her, at the brass lantern and the bent head, and the patience of her, and something in the look on his face was not the look of a master at a servant. Then she felt the draft of the open door, and turned, and they regarded each other across the long gold room, and for the first time neither of them looked away. He asked what she was reading. She told him. It was an old account of the building of the house, his great-grandfather's diary, and she had been reading, not for the work, but for the pleasure of it, and she admitted this with a directness that seemed to surprise him, because most people in his house told him what they thought he wished to hear. He crossed the room and looked at the page over her shoulder, careful not to stand too close, and he read a line aloud, his great-grandfather's account of the planting of the Avenue of Limes, and his voice changed as he read it, lost some of its coldness, and Beatrice understood that this man loved the place the lawyer was using to trap him, loved it the way she had loved a lantern by a gate, as the one thing that was truly his. They talked for an hour. They talked of the diary, and then of the books, and then, somehow, of nothing in particular. Two people in a warm circle of light, in a dark house. And he did not ask her about herself, and she did not offer. And yet, by the end of the hour, each of them knew a great deal more about the other than either had said. When he left, he paused at the door and looked back at the lantern. He said it was an unusual thing for a governess to carry. She said it had been her father's. He waited, as though she might say more, and when she did not, he nodded, and there was something in the nod that acknowledged a privacy he would not breach, and he wished her good night, and he used her name, and the way he said it was different from the way he had said it on the staircase. And she sat for a long time after he had gone with her hand resting on the warm brass, and her heart doing a thing she had forbidden it to do. They fell, after that, into a habit neither of them named. He came to the library in the evenings. He told himself it was for the books, and she told herself it was her duty to be there, and these fictions served them both for a while. He found that he could speak to her as he could speak to no one else, that her composure was not coldness, but a kind of strength, that she answered his sharpness with a wit that disarmed it, that she neither flattered him nor feared him, and that an hour in the gold room with the lantern burning was the only hour of his day he did not have to perform. She found that the proud, cold man the county whispered about was a tired one, a man who had been disappointed so often that he had decided to expect nothing, which she understood completely because it was the bargain she had made with her own heart years before. They were, she thought, two people who had taught themselves to want less, sitting in a small light, slowly and against all sense, beginning to want. It built the way real things build, which is to say slowly, and out of nothing that could be pointed to afterward and named as the cause. It built out of 100 small evenings. He would come in with a book and a question, and stay an hour over an answer that took a minute. She would have a passage marked to show him, having found it in the day and thought, without admitting to herself that she was thinking it, that he would like it. They argued about a translation, and she was right, and he conceded it with a dry grace that surprised her. And the next evening he brought it up again, only to hear her be right a second time. And she understood that he was not a man who minded being bested, that he had been starved so long of anyone willing to best him, that her plain disagreement was a kind of gift to him, and she gave it freely after that. And the room grew warm with the particular warmth of two clever people who have found, late and unexpectedly, someone worth talking to. He remarked, one evening, watching her shelve a difficult run of volumes by some private system of her own, that the whole county believed him a hard man to please. She answered without looking up that the whole county was mistaken, that he was not hard to please at all, only hard to deceive, and that the two were very often confused by people who would rather be lied to. He was quiet a moment. He said that was a dangerous thing to say to one's employer. She said that she had found, in her experience, that the people worth working for were precisely the ones to whom dangerous things could safely be said, and that if she was wrong about him, she would soon know it. And he looked at her across the lamplight for a long moment, and said that she was not wrong about him, and there was more in the saying of it than the words held. And they both heard the more, and neither of them named it. Another night he asked her, half in jest, whether there was anything at all she was afraid of, since she seemed afraid of neither her station, nor her master, nor the dark corridors of his house. She considered the question honestly, as she considered everything. She said she was afraid of exactly one thing, which was of letting herself want something she could not keep. because she had learned that the wanting cost more than the going without, and that she had spent a great many years making herself very good at going without. He did not answer that. He could not, for it was the truest thing either of them had yet said in that room, and it was his own affliction spoken in her voice, and he sat with it in the warm gold light, and understood that the woman across the table had just described, without knowing it, the precise shape of the wall he had built around his own heart, and that hers was built of the very same stone. They did not touch. That was the strange and tender heart of it. For weeks they did not so much as brush hands, and the not touching became its own language, a thing they were both aware of every moment. The careful foot of distance he kept when he stood beside her chair to read over her shoulder, the way she would move a candlestick or a book to give her hands something to do when his nearness made them want to do something else. She noticed that he had a particular way of going still when she said a thing that moved him, a stillness like a held breath, and she found herself saying true things to watch him go still. He noticed that she touched the brass of the lantern when she was thinking, an absent stroke of the warm metal, and he found that he watched her hand on the lantern more than was sensible. And once, reaching at the same moment to steady a stack of falling books, his hand came down over hers on the table, only for an instant, only by accident, and they both froze, and the books slid and fell, and neither of them moved to catch them, and the small, warm shock of it sat between them long after he had drawn his hand away, and apologized, and she had said it was nothing. It was not nothing. They both knew it was not nothing, but they were a governess and an earl, and he was a man who believed himself broken, and she was a woman who had trained herself to expect the door to close, and so they let it be nothing, and went on talking in the lamplight as though the world were not slowly, quietly, against all sense, rearranging itself around the table where they sat. There was a night. It nearly broke open. The rain was at the windows, and the house was asleep, and he had stayed later than usual, and they had fallen into one of the long, comfortable silences that had become, between them, more intimate than most people's words, and she had looked up from her page and found him watching her, not the lantern this time, but her face, openly, with something undisguised in his eyes, and the moment stretched, 1 second, 2 seconds, the rain loud on the glass, and she felt the whole of her want rise up in her like the river rising in the dark, and she thought, he is going to say it, and she thought, I will let him, and then the great clock in the hall struck the hour, 12 slow strokes, and the spell broke, and he rose, and he wished her good night in a voice not quite steady, and he went, and she sat alone with the lantern and her heart going like a hammer, and understood that she had passed, without noticing the moment of crossing, entirely beyond the safety she had spent her life building, and that there was no road back to it, and that she did not, God help her, want one. One evening, he told her about his marriage. He did not mean to. They were speaking of the diary, and then of his father. And then he was telling her, in the flat voice men use for the things that have hurt them most, about the cold wife, and the colder house, and the funeral, where he had stood dry-eyed and known himself a monster for it. He said he had thought, after, that he was a man who could not love, that the fault was in him, that he had been built wrong. He said it as a fact, the way he said everything, but his hands were not still as he said it, and Beatrice, watching his hands, understood what it cost him. She did not tell him he was wrong. She did not tell him anything that would have been easy to say or easy to hear. She let the silence hold after his confession, the way one holds still beside a wounded animal so as not to startle it further, and then she told him, slowly, a thing she had told no one, about her own father, about the careless, gentle man who had ruined them with horses and kindness, about the lantern at the gate, and the cold schoolroom at the top of the house, and the 2 slow presses of a dying hand that meant, be still, I am here. She told him she had stood at her father's grave dry-eyed too, not because she did not love him, but because she had used up every tear she had years before, in the long, slow watching of him fail, and that she had wondered, as Edmund wondered, whether something in her was broken, whether a woman who could not weep at the right time was a woman built wrong. And then she said the thing she had come, over the long autumn, to believe. She said she did not think a man who could grieve a thing was a man who could not love, only a man who had not yet been given the right thing to love, and that grief withheld is not grief absent, that the people who feel the most are very often the people who have learned, out of long necessity, to show the least, and that she had stopped some time ago, believing in the kind of love that announces itself loudly, and started believing instead in the quieter kind, the kind that lights a lantern at a gate every single evening for years, without ever once saying the word. The room was very quiet after she said it. The lantern burned. Neither of them moved, and the distance between his hand on the table and hers had somehow, over the course of the telling, become very small, a hand's breadth, less the space of a single decision, and she was aware of it the way one is aware of the edge of a high place, that nearness, that drop, that terrible sweet pull. He did not cross it. She did not cross it, but they both looked at it, and they both knew it was there. And when at last he rose to go, he stood for a moment, looking down at her in the lamplight, as though there were a great deal he wished to say, and no permission in the world to say it. And then he only said her name, once, softly, the way a man says a thing he has been turning over in private, and went, and she sat alone a long time with her hand where his had almost been. The wedding was 3 weeks off. Cordelia Finch came and went, planning, bright and busy, and Silas Crane came too, his eyes everywhere, and it was Crane who first noticed the governess. He noticed her the way a careful man notices a thing out of place, and Beatrice felt his attention land on her one afternoon in the hall, and knew at once that she had let herself be too easy in the house, too settled, and that a man who had forged a will to take an inheritance would not be slow to recognize the daughter he had robbed. She saw the moment he placed her. She was carrying the lantern, foolishly, openly, and his eyes went to it, and then to her face, and the smile he had worn in her father's drawing room came back to him, and he inclined his head to her with a courtesy that was worse than any threat. And he said, softly, so that no one else could hear, that he believed they had met before, in a house of mourning, and that he hoped she was finding her reduced circumstances bearable. Beatrice curtsied. She said she found them very bearable indeed. She said it pleasantly, with her chin level, and she watched the small flicker of unease cross his face when she did not flinch. And she understood that she had just made an enemy, careful enough to be dangerous, and that the war she had carried in her chest since the funeral had, in that moment in the hall, quietly begun. Crane moved first, as she had known he would. He could not have her in the house. This daughter of the man he had robbed, this composed and watchful woman, who carried a lantern and did not flinch, and he set about removing her, with the patience that was his only art. He spoke to Augusta Vane. The two of them, Beatrice would later learn, had been partners in the thing from the beginning, the stepmother who wanted the whole of Thornfield, and the lawyer who could make a page say what he wished, and they had divided the spoils between them. And the daughter walking free with her dignity intact was a loose thread that frightened them both. Augusta wrote to the earl. It was a careful letter, full of concern, the letter of a respectable woman performing a Christian duty, and it informed his lordship that the governess he had taken in was not the modest creature she appeared, that she had been turned out of her father's house for reasons a lady could not commit to paper, that her presence among decent people was a thing he ought, for his own sake and his bride's, to consider. Beatrice did not see the letter. She saw its effect. She saw the earl grow cold to her again over the space of a single day, saw the warmth go out of him as though a window had been shut, and she did not understand it, and could not ask, because she was the governess, and he was the earl, and the brief, warm country of the library had no standing in the daylight world of the house. He stopped coming in the evenings. The first night she told herself he was merely busy with his guests, with the endless arrangements of the coming wedding, and she lit her lantern and waited and worked and did not let herself watch the door. The second night, she knew. There is a particular quality to a withdrawal that has decided itself, a coldness that is not absence, but choice. And she felt it come off him in the corridors when they passed, felt his eyes go past her now as they had gone past her on the staircase that first day, as though she were once more only a hem and a dust and a thing not worth the remembering. And she understood that whatever had been built in the gold room over the long autumn had been, for him, undone, and that she did not know why, and that she had no right to ask. She sat alone with her lantern and her books, and told herself it was for the best, that she had been a fool to let herself feel anything, that nothing had been promised, and nothing had been owed, that a governess who lets herself dream of an earl has only herself to blame for the waking. But the loss of it sat in her chest, like a stone. She had not known, until it was taken, how much she had come to live for that single warm hour at the end of each cold day, how much of herself she had quietly given back into the keeping of those evenings, how thoroughly she had broken the one rule she had built her whole life upon, the rule that said, want less, expect nothing, keep your light small, so that no one can put it out. She had let her light be seen. She had let herself be known. And now, the man who had known her looked through her in the corridors, and she went back each night to the narrow bed under the eaves and lay in the dark beside the unlit lantern, and understood, with a clarity that was its own kind of grief, exactly how much she had wanted, and exactly how far she had fallen, and exactly how little, in the end, the wanting had been worth. The earl, for his part, did not know what to think. He had received the letter, and he had not believed it, or had not wished to, and yet the seed of it had gone in, because a man who has been disappointed by everyone half expects to be disappointed again, and the worst cruelty of Augusta's letter was that it asked him to mistrust the one person he had begun to trust. He watched Beatrice from a distance. He saw her dignity and her diligence, and the way the servants spoke of her, and none of it matched the letter, and the mismatch tormented him. He told himself it did not matter, that he was to be married in a fortnight to a girl with 30,000 pounds, that the governess was nothing to him. He almost believed it. But a man cannot quite lie to himself in the small hours. And in the small hours, Edmund Ravensworth lay awake and knew the truth of what he was doing, which was that he was about to marry, for the second time in his life, a person he did not love, in order to settle an account, and that he was about to do it while the one person he had ever been able to love sat alone 2 floors below in a library he no longer let himself enter. He had let a letter do this, a careful, poisonous letter from a woman he had never met, full of hints and decencies, and he had let it turn him cold, because cold was easier than the alternative, because to trust Beatrice Hartwell was to admit that he wanted her, and to want her was to stand once more at the edge of the high place he had sworn after his first marriage never to approach again. So he had stepped back. He had told himself it was prudence. He knew, in the small hours, that it was cowardice, and the knowing did not make him brave, only ashamed. And a man's shame is a poor foundation for a marriage, and he was building one upon it, with his eyes open. And then, the night before the great betrothal ball, the thing happened that made belief impossible. It was late. The house was full of guests come for the ball, and Beatrice had stayed in the library to be out of their way, and she heard through the wall that the library shared with the small study. 2 voices she knew, the stepmother's and the lawyer's, raised a little with wine and confidence, speaking of the thing they had done. She went still. She put down her pen, and she stood in the dark library, with her hand on the warm lantern. And she listened to Silas Crane and Augusta Vane congratulate each other, in the careless way of people who believe themselves unheard, on the cleverness of a forged will, on the simplicity of disinheriting a girl who had no money to fight them, on the particular satisfaction of having done it so neatly that the fool of a father had died, believing his daughter provided for. She heard Augusta laugh. She heard Crane say that the only loose end was the girl herself, and that he had attended to her, and that after the Earl's wedding made him secure, there would be no one left in the county to take her word over theirs. She heard her own ruin, and her father's betrayal spoken aloud as a comedy, and she stood in the dark and did not move, and the war in her chest, which had been a private thing, became in that moment a cold and total resolve. She would have justice. Not vengeance, she told herself, though the line between them was thin that night. Justice. She would prove the will false, and her father robbed, and these two people what they were. And she would do it in the open, before this same society that had watched her father buried and her birthright stolen. And she would do it with her chin level and her hands folded, the way her father had taught her, without ever meaning to. But she had no proof. She had only what she had overheard, the word of a governess against a respectable widow and a prosperous lawyer, and she knew exactly how much that was worth in the world she lived in, which was nothing. She needed the true will, if one existed, and she did not know that it did. She needed a witness, and the only witnesses were the two people who had done the thing. She sat down at the library table in the small hours of the morning, with the lantern burning low, and she thought, the way her father had taught her to think, slowly and without panic, and she remembered the thing he had tried to say at the end, the sound like a place or a key, and she turned it over and over in the failing light. And somewhere near dawn, as the lantern began to gutter, she understood, not a key, a name, the name of a place. Her father, dying with his last strength, had been trying to tell her where he had put the thing he wanted her to have. The betrothal ball was the grandest night Ravensworth Hall had seen in 20 years. The shut rooms were opened, the chandeliers were lit, 1,000 candles, and the county came in its silks and its jewels to see the cold Earl betrothed at last. And Cordelia Finch stood at the head of the great staircase, in white and diamonds, and glowed with the certainty of a girl who has everything she has been taught to want. Beatrice was not invited, of course. She was the governess. But she had a thing to do that night, and the noise and the crowd and the open rooms gave her the cover she needed. And so while the music played below, she slipped along the dark upper corridors to the one room she had not yet been permitted to enter, the late Earl's private closet, where, Mrs. Dunmore had once let slip, the master kept the papers he trusted to no steward. She did not expect to find her father's will there. She expected nothing. She had only reasoned, in the long night, that her father, knowing himself dying, knowing his wife, and his lawyer, would not have left the thing that mattered where they could reach it, and that the one man in the county he had still trusted, the one old friend whose honor was beyond Augusta's buying, was the late Earl of Ravensworth, Edmund's father, dead these 2 years, in whose private closet the papers of trusted friends might still lie undisturbed. It was a thin thread. She followed it because it was the only one she had. The closet was locked. She had thought it might be, and she stood before the locked door in the dark corridor, with the music of the ball rising faint through the floor beneath her, and she felt, for one cold moment, the full foolishness of where she was, a governess in her plain dress in a part of the house forbidden to her, on the strength of a guess built on a guess, with nothing in her hands but a lantern and a hope. And then she looked down at the lantern. She had carried it everywhere, for half a year. She had carried it out of Thornfield, and along 11 miles of road, and up into this great, cold house, and through every room of it. And she had lit it every single evening. And not once in all that time had it occurred to her to ask why her father, who had thought of everything, who had hidden the truth of his estate where the wicked would never find it, should have troubled, with almost the last breath in his body, to leave his daughter a lantern. She had thought it sentiment. She had thought it the one gentle gesture a ruined father could afford. She remembered now, standing before the locked door, the small hidden compartment in the lantern's brass base, the one her father had shown her as a child, where he had kept a spare key to the gate, so that the household need never be locked out. And she remembered his hand over hers, and his voice, and the way he had said, "You will always know where to find what you need. If you remember to look in the place no one else would think to." Her hand shook. She turned the lantern over. She found the seam in the brass with her thumbnail, the way she had found it as a girl, and she pressed, and the small compartment slid open, and inside, wrapped in a scrap of oiled silk that her father's own hands had folded, was a small iron key, and folded with it, a single line in her father's true hand, the real hand, the firm, clear hand she would have known among 10,000. For Beatrice, when she has need of it, she had been carrying it all along, through the disinheritance and the long walk and the cold months in the library. She had carried her father's last gift to her in her hands every single day, and never known. She wept then, for the first time since his death, standing in the dark corridor with the music rising through the floor, not for grief now, but for the unbearable tenderness of a dying man who had thought of everything, who had hidden the key in the one thing he knew his daughter would never let go of, and trusted her to understand him in time. Then she dried her face. She fit the key to the lock, and the closet opened. Inside, among the papers of 2 dead men who had been friends, she found it. Her father's true will, signed and witnessed and dated 3 weeks before the forged one, leaving Thornfield and all he had to his daughter Beatrice, with a letter folded inside it, addressed to her in his hand. She did not read the letter then. There was no time, and some part of her could not yet bear it. She took the will and the letter, and she pressed the closet shut, and she stood in the dark, with the proof of everything in her hands, and the lantern burning steady. And she heard, behind her, a step, and she turned, and it was the earl. He had left his own betrothal ball. He had seen her slip from the edge of the crowd, a pale figure on the stairs, where no servant should be, and something, he could not have said what, had made him follow. And he stood now at the end of the dark corridor in his black evening coat, and looked at the governess, with the lantern and the papers, and the tears not quite dried on her face. And he did not call for anyone, and he did not ask what she was doing in his father's closet. And Beatrice understood, looking at him, that the cold of the past fortnight had been a lie he had told himself, and that whatever else was true, the man before her was not her enemy. She told him everything. She told him there in the dark corridor, with the music below, quickly and plainly, the way her father had told her hard things, the forged will and the dead father, and the lawyer in his good coat, who had bought up an earl's debts and meant to settle them with a marriage. And as she spoke, she watched the understanding move across his face, watched him see the shape of the trap he was standing in, watched the cold, proud mask he wore for the world fall away to show the man beneath it. And when she had finished, he was silent for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, that the man who had forged her father's will was at that moment drinking his wine and dancing at his ball, and that he, Edmund, had nearly married the man's ward, and signed away his own house to a thief, and that he was grateful to her beyond anything he knew how to say. She said there was no time for gratitude. She said the will proved her case, but that Crane would destroy it the instant he knew it existed, that a paper could be burned, that she needed the thing witnessed by men whose word the county would take before any of it could be made safe. And the Earl looked at her, and something kindled in his tired eyes that she had not seen there before, something that was almost a smile. And he said that it happened. He had a room full of the most respectable men in the county, standing one floor below, and that it would be a great pity to waste them. They went down together, not as earl and governess. There was a moment, at the top of the great staircase, before they began the descent, when he turned to her in the half-dark of the landing and looked at her, at the plain dress and the level chin and the papers held against her chest and the lantern in her hand, and he said, low, that she did not have to do this, that he could have Crane taken quietly in the morning and spare her the eyes of the whole county, that she had already been made a spectacle of enough in her life, and did not owe the room her courage. And Beatrice looked back at him, and she understood that he was offering her, for the first time, a choice that was truly hers, with nothing forcing it, and that the offering of it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in 2 years. She said that she had been made small in the dark by these people, and that she would be made right in the light, before the same kind of room that had watched her buried, or she would not be made right at all. She said her father had taught her that the point of a light was to be seen by, and she lifted her chin, and she put her hand, lightly, of her own accord, upon the Earl's offered arm, the first time she had touched him on purpose in all the long autumn, and the touch went through them both, like the small warm shock of the falling books, and together they came down the great staircase side by side into the blaze of the ballroom, and the music faltered, and the dancing stopped, and 1,000 candles lit the faces of the county turning to stare, and Cordelia Finch in her white and diamonds looked up in confusion, and Augusta Vane, who had come to see her stepdaughter's master safely married, went the color of ash, and Silas Crane set down his glass very carefully. The Earl did not raise his voice. He had learned somewhere in his cold years that a quiet voice in a silent room carries further than a shout. He said that he begged the company's pardon for the interruption, and that before the night's announcement was made, there was a matter of justice that touched his house and could not wait. And he turned to Beatrice and asked her, before them all, to say what she had told him in the corridor above. And Beatrice Hartwell, the governess, the disinherited daughter, the woman who had walked 11 miles with a lantern and 2 dresses, stood in the center of the great ballroom with her chin level and her hands folded and her father's true will in her hand. And she told them all of it, clearly, without heat, in the voice she had been saving for 2 years. She held up the forged will, which the Earl had sent a footman to fetch from Crane's own case, while the man stood frozen, and she held up the true one beside it, and she showed the county the 2 dates and the 2 hands, the signature on a night her father lay too weak to lift a spoon, and the signature 3 weeks before, in the firm, clear hand they all knew, and she told them of the key her father had hidden in the lantern, and she read aloud the single line, "For Beatrice, when she has need of it," and the great room was so silent that the candles could be heard. Then she turned to Silas Crane, and she asked him, pleasantly, with her chin level, whether he wished to tell the company himself how he had come to read a will signed by a dying man who could not hold a pen, or whether he would prefer she finish the account for him. Crane did not answer. He had built his whole life on the principle that no one would ever take a wronged woman's word over a prosperous man's, and he stood in the ruin of that principle and found he had nothing to say, and his silence was the loudest confession the county had ever heard. Augusta Vane began to speak, to protest, to summon her wounded dignity, and a gentleman of the county, a magistrate as it happened, who had known Beatrice's father for 30 years, and had wondered at the strange will, and said nothing, stepped forward into the silence, and took the 2 documents from Beatrice's hands, and looked at them for a long moment, and then looked at Crane, and said, in a voice like a door closing, that he thought this had best be continued before the bench in the morning, and that he would trouble Mr. Crane and Mrs. Vane to consider themselves not at liberty to leave the county. It was over in less time than it takes to tell. There was no shouting. The vindication, when it came, was not a thing of triumph, but of silence. The silence of 100 respectable people, understanding at once that they had been about to celebrate a crime. The silence of a magistrate, folding 2 papers into his coat. The silence of a smiling girl in white, realizing that her guardian was a thief, and her marriage a fraud. The silence of a stepmother whose handkerchief was finally, genuinely, of some use. Beatrice did not gloat. She had imagined this moment for 2 years, and in her imagining there had been satisfaction, and now that it had come, she found there was none. Only a great weariness and a strange grief, because justice, she discovered, does not give you back the years or the father. It only stops the lie, and the stopping of a lie is a quiet thing. She lowered her hands. She had nothing more to say, and the county, which had come to a betrothal, went home to a scandal, and the great house emptied of its guests, and by midnight the only people left in the blaze of the dying candles were the earl and the governess, standing where the dancing had been, a little apart, neither of them quite knowing what they were now to each other. The morning sorted the law of it. The magistrate sat, and the 2 wills were examined by men who knew hands, and the forgery was plain, and Silas Crane and Augusta Vane were taken into the cold machinery of the courts that they had used so confidently against a girl who could not fight back, and it ground them as it grinds everyone in the end. Thornfield was restored to Beatrice, and the debts that Crane had bought up against Ravensworth, it emerged, had been gathered with money that was partly stolen, and much of that web came apart in the unraveling, so that the earl found himself, when the dust settled, not free of all trouble, but free of the particular trap that had been built for him, and no longer in any need at all of a marriage to a cotton fortune. Cordelia Finch went back to Manchester. She was not, in the end, a wicked girl, only a sheltered one, and the discovery that her guardian was a criminal and her bridegroom had never loved her seemed to wake something in her, and she left with more dignity than she had arrived with. And Beatrice, who might have hated her, found she could not, and wished her well, and meant it. And so, on a gray afternoon, some weeks later, with the law satisfied and the houses sorted, and the scandal already cooling into the county's long memory, Beatrice Hartwell stood once more in the library at Ravensworth, a guest now, and not a servant, an heiress in her own right, free to go home to Thornfield whenever she chose. And the earl came in, and they faced each other across the long gold room where it had all begun. And for the first time, there was nothing between them. No debt, no arrangement, no difference of station that the law recognized, nothing at all but the thing they had both spent the autumn refusing to name. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire ticked in the grate. The lantern, which she still carried, still lit each evening, stood on the table between them, where it had stood on the night they first truly spoke. And its small, steady glow was the same glow, and the room was the same room. And yet everything in it had changed, because they were both, for the first time, free. And freedom, she was discovering, is a more frightening thing to stand in than any trap. He did not make it easy on himself. He told her plainly, in the flat, honest voice she had come to love, that he had wronged her, that he had let a cruel letter turn him cold to her, when he should have trusted what he knew, that he had nearly married a stranger for money, while the only person he had ever been able to speak to sat alone in his library each night, and that he had no right, after all of it, to ask her for anything. He said he had thought himself a man who could not love, and had discovered he was wrong, and that the discovering had come too late to deserve her, and that he would not insult her by pretending his title or his house could weigh against the wrong he had done. And then he stopped because he was a proud man and had reached the end of what pride would let him say. Beatrice let the silence hold. 1 second, 2 seconds. She had learned long ago to want less than she was offered, so that she could not be hurt, and she stood now and felt that old, hard habit ask her to be safe, to be guarded, to take her freedom and her father's house, and go. And she looked at the man before her, at the tired, honest face, and the still hands that were not still now, and she understood that the bravest thing she had ever done was not to walk 11 miles with a lantern, nor to stand in a ballroom and accuse a thief, but the thing she was about to do, which was to want something openly, and to say so. She said that she had a condition. He looked up. She said that she had learned from a father who lit a lantern at a gate so that no traveler would lose his way, that the point of a light is not to keep it for yourself, and that she had spent too many years keeping her own light small so that no one could take it. She said that she would not marry a man out of arrangement, nor out of gratitude, nor to settle a debt, that she had had her fill of marriages made for money, and would not make one herself if it were the last roof in England. She said the only marriage she would make was a free one, between two people who chose each other with nothing, forcing the choice, no will, no debt, no lawyer and a good coat, and that as it happened, for the first time in either of their lives, they were both entirely free, and that he might, if he liked, ask her again now, with nothing in the world compelling either of them, and see what she said. The earl crossed the room. He did not hurry. He came to stand before her, in the gold light of the lantern, close now, closer than he had ever let himself stand in all the careful evenings of the autumn. And she did not step back, and he reached out, slowly, giving her every moment in which to refuse, and he took her hand, her bare hand, in both of his, and his hands, she felt, were not steady, and that small unsteadiness undid her more than any speech could have, because it told her that the cold, proud earl the county feared was, in this one moment, as frightened as she was, and as undefended, and as wholly in earnest. He asked her, with nothing forcing the asking, no will, no debt, no lawyer and a good coat, nothing in all the world compelling either of them, whether she would do him the honor that he had no right to, and wanted more than anything he had ever wanted or ever expected to be allowed to want. And Beatrice Hartwell, who had taught herself for 21 years to want less, to keep her light small, to expect the door to close, looked up into the tired, honest face of the man who had crossed a ballroom and a winter and the whole length of his own fear to reach her, and she let herself, at last, after a lifetime of careful smallness, want everything, openly, without apology, and she turned her hand in his so that their fingers laced, and she said yes. She said it once, quietly, the way the true things are said. And then he smiled, a real smile, the first she had ever seen him give, and it changed his whole grave face the way a candle changes a dark room, and she understood that she had been right all along, that he had never been a man who could not love, only a man who had not yet been given the right thing to love, and that the right thing, against every expectation either of them had ever held, had turned out to be her. They were married in the spring, in the small chapel on the Ravensworth land, with the limes his great-grandfather had planted coming into leaf along the avenue. And it was a small wedding, and a quiet one. And the only guests were the servants who had been kind to her, and Mrs. Dunmore weeping frankly into a handkerchief that was, this time, thoroughly wet, and the magistrate who had taken the will from her hands, and a few old friends of 2 dead fathers who had loved them both. Beatrice wore a gown of pale gray, the color of the morning light in the library, and she carried no flowers. But she had asked, and Edmund had understood, without her having to explain, and so beside the altar, on a small table where the light from the chapel window fell across it, stood her father's brass carriage lantern, lit, the small flame holding steady in the spring air, so that both their dead fathers might be said to be present, and so that the light her father had kept for travelers might shine, for once, on its own, daughter come safely home. When the moment came for her to speak her part, she found she could not, for a breath, get the words out, not from grief now, but from the great unfamiliar weight of being, after so long, exactly where she wished to be, and Edmund beside her, saw the struggle, and did the thing that told her more than any vow could have, which was to wait. He did not fill the silence. He did not prompt her. He simply stood and held her hand and gave her the time, the way he had learned to give her the time across 100 evenings in the gold room, and she gathered herself in her own moment, and spoke her vow plainly and clearly, in the level voice she had been saving all her life, and he spoke his, and the small flame on the table beside them did not so much as waver, and it was done. There was no crowd to whisper. There was no county to judge. There was only the light, and the limes coming into leaf, and the few who had been kind, and a man and a woman who had each been certain, not so very long before, that love was a country they had been born too cold to enter, standing together at last inside its borders, having found the road in the dark. The letter she had found folded in the true will. She had read at last, alone, the night before the wedding. It was short. Her father had never been a man of many words. He wrote that he knew what Augusta was and what Crane was, that he was too weak and too far gone to fight them, and too proud to let his daughter watch him try and fail, and that he had done the only thing left to a dying man, which was to hide the truth, where the wicked would never think to look and trust his daughter to be cleverer than her enemies, which he had always known she was. He wrote that he was sorry, and he wrote it plainly, with none of the soft evasions of his living years. He was sorry for the horses, and the borrowed money, and the careless slide that had put them in that woman's power. He was sorry for the schoolroom at the top of the house, and the seat below the family, and the long lesson of being made small, which he had been too weak and too ashamed to spare her. He wrote that he had failed her in almost every way a father can fail a child, in every practical and worldly way, and that he knew it, and that he would not insult her by pretending otherwise at the last. But he wrote, too, that there was one thing he did not think he had failed at, and that he had proof of it, and the proof was this. He wrote that on the nights he lay too weak to rise, he had watched from his bed through the window as a small, steady light came up at the gate, lit by his daughter's own hand, because the groom had forgotten and her father could not, and that he had lain there in the dark of his sick room, and seen that small flame hold against the wind night after night, and known, watching it, that whatever fortune he had lost, and whatever ruin was coming, he had not failed to raise a daughter who would keep a light burning in the dark when no one asked her to, and no one was watching, and there was every reason in the world to let it go out. And he wrote, at the end, the thing he had been trying to say with his last breath, the thing she had thought was a place or a key, which was neither, which was only her name, and after it 3 words, lighted always. Beatrice folded the letter and held it for a long time, and then she did the only thing there was to do, which was to carry the lantern down to the gate of Ravensworth that night, the great gate at the foot of the long park, and light it, though no one had asked her to and no traveler was expected, and stand in the spring dark and watch the small flame hold against the wind, the way she had stood as a girl, the way she would stand now for the rest of her life, in a house that was warm again, beside a man who had learned, late and against all his expectation, that he could love and be loved with the light her father had given her burning steady at the gate of her home. 2 years later, the avenue of limes was in full leaf, and the great rooms of Ravensworth were open and lit and full of life, and the cold earl the county had whispered about was gone, replaced by a quieter, warmer man, who rode out each morning with his wife beside him, and came home each evening to a house that no longer needed to pretend. Thornfield, restored, they kept, but did not live in. Beatrice could not quite bear to make it home again, and instead, she opened it, with the magistrate's blessing, as a place for the daughters of gentlemen left as she had been left, with nowhere to go, and no one to take their word, and she ran it herself, and the county that had once watched her buried in scandal came, in time, to speak her name with the particular respect it reserves for those it has wronged and cannot quite apologize to. She knew what it was to arrive somewhere with 2 dresses and a lantern, and no one to vouch for you. And so the women who came to Thornfield were never asked to prove themselves worthy of the roof before they were given it. They were fed first, and warmed first, and believed first, and the questions, if there were questions, came after, the way her father had once said that a house lights its lamp before it asks the traveler his name. Edmund came with her often when she went to see to the place, and he, who had spent his cold years certain he was a man of no use to anyone, found a strange late happiness in it, in being needed by someone other than his accounts, in watching his wife do plainly and well the things she had been born to do, and been robbed of the chance to do. And the 2 of them would drive home along the lime avenue in the long summer evenings with the work behind them, easy in each other's company in the way that takes most marriages a lifetime to learn, and had taken theirs a single hard winter. And more than once, watching her in the carriage light, he thought that the lawyer who had tried to ruin them both had, in the end, by every cruelty he intended, only driven them toward the one thing in the world that could have saved them, which was each other. Augusta Vane was not spoken of. Silas Crane was not spoken of. They had been displaced into the cold, quiet machinery that swallows such people, and the county let them go from its conversation the way it lets go of an unpleasant winter once the spring has come. Cordelia Finch wrote once, a kind, awkward letter wishing them happy, and Beatrice answered it kindly. And that was the end of that. And every evening at the gate of Ravensworth Hall, a small brass lantern was lit, sometimes by the groom and sometimes by the lady of the house herself, when she felt the want of her father near her, and it burned through the dark for any traveler who might lose the road, the way it had burned at another gate, for a frightened girl who had learned that a thing does not have to be large to refuse to go out. Beatrice was 23 now. She had been left on the worst morning of her life, nothing in all the world but a lantern by a gate, and she had discovered in the end that it had been the only thing worth leaving her, because everything else they took could be taken, and the one thing they could not take was the light her father had taught her to keep. She stood at the gate in the spring dark, with her husband's hand in hers, and watched the flame hold steady, and she did not weep, because there was nothing left to weep for, and a great deal, at last, to be quiet and glad about. Some inheritances are written in a will and stolen with a pen. The ones that matter are handed to you in the dark and trusted to your keeping, and no forger alive can take them, because they were never written down at all. So tell me, before the candle gutters and tonight's chapter ends, when everything was taken from her, was it the lantern that saved Beatrice, or was it the thing inside her that she had been carrying all along? Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me which you believe.